He had no mother, no father, and nowhere warm to sleep. So every night, 9-year-old Michael crept into the frozen barn and pressed himself against an agging grey horse named Vao, the only friend he had left in the world. But when his uncle sold that horse to a slaughter buyer 80 kilometers away, what that old horse did next to find the boy in the dead of winter left hardened Sir Chandrescu Cruz speechless. This is the story of a boy who had nothing left but a horse, and a horse who refused to let him go. 9-year-old Michael was thrown into the care of a bitter uncle who saw him as a burden. Denied a bed and locked out of the house each night, the boy crept into the barn and pressed himself against an agging grey horse named Vao to survive the brutal winter. But when his uncle sold that horse for profit, what Vao did next would defy every assumption about what an animal is willing to sacrifice. To understand how far that bond stretched, you have to go back to the day Michael's parents were buried, and the uncle made a choice that would echo through this community for years. The day they lowered Michael's parents into the frozen ground, his uncle Harold stood at the graveside with his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. He had not wanted to take the boy in. He had told the social worker as much, arguing that at 63 years old and managing a struggling farm alone, he had no room for a child. But the alternative was state custody, and the neighbors were already watching. So Harold signed the papers with a grunt, loaded the boy into his rusted pickup, and drove him to a farmhouse that had seen better decades. The first night, Michael stood in the kitchen doorway while his uncle ate a silent supper. When the boy asked where he would sleep, Harold jerked his thumb toward the barn without looking up. He told Michael that the house was full, that there was no spare bed, and that if he wanted warmth, he could earn it by working. Michael was 9 years old. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a small photograph of his parents that he kept folded in his pocket. The barn was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of hay and animals. In the corner of the largest stall stood an old grey horse, his coat dulled with age, his joints stiff from years of labor. His name was Viejo, a Spanish word that meant old one. The uncle had bought him at auction a decade ago, and now the horse was too slow for plowing, too tired for pulling, and not worth the hay he ate. Harold had already spoken to a livestock buyer who offered a modest sum for the animal, and he planned to finalize the sale before spring. But Michael did not know any of that first night. He saw only a massive, gentle creature with eyes that seemed to understand suffering. He crept into the stall, shivering so hard his teeth chattered, and pressed himself against the horse's warm flank. Viejo did not startle. He did not move away. He simply lowered his great head and exhaled slowly, as if accepting the boy as his own. What began as survival became a nightly ritual. Michael would finish his chores, wait until the farmhouse lights went out, and slip through the darkness to the barn. Each time, Viejo would nicker softly, a low sound of recognition that cut through the silence. The horse would bend his knees and lie down on the straw, positioning his body so that Michael could curl against his belly, the animal's massive frame shielding the boy from the biting drafts that slipped through the barn's weathered boards. The horse's body heat, radiating through his coarse coat, was the only blanket the child had. Wordlessly, these two outcasts formed a bond that transcended species. Michael would whisper his secrets into the horse's ear, telling him about his mother's laugh, his father's hands, the way their house had smelled of bread on Sunday mornings. Viejo would listen without judgment, his ears swiveling toward the boy's voice, his dark eyes watching with a patience that seemed almost human. In a world that had stripped Michael of everything, this agging horse gave him the one thing he needed most: the simple, unwavering presence of another living being who would not abandon him. But the arrangement could not last. The uncle, as callous as he was not blind. He noticed that the boy seemed oddly warm each morning despite the freezing nights. He noticed the hay pressed into Michael's hair, the horse hairs clinging to his threadbare coat. And one bitter night in late January, when the wind howled through the farm like a wounded animal, Harold decided to investigate. He crossed the frozen yard with a lantern in his hand, pushed open the barn door, and stepped into the stall where his unwanted nephew lay sleeping peacefully against the chest of a horse that was supposed to be nothing more than livestock. For a long moment, Harold stood there in stunned silence, the lantern light flickering across the impossible scene. Then his face twisted with something dark, a mixture of fury at being defied and something deeper, something uglier. He did not wake the boy. He simply turned on his heel and walked back toward the house, already calculating the price of the lesson he intended to teach them both. The next morning, Michael woke to the sound of a diesel engine and the heavy clang of a metal ramp. He blinked against the pale winter light cutting through the barn slats, still pressed against Viejo's warm side, and knew instantly that something was wrong. The horse was tense beneath him, ears flat, nostrils flaring with a low, uneasy rattle. Then Harold's voice cut through the cold air, sharp as a blade, directing two men to lead the old animal out. Michael scrambled up, hay clinging to his thin coat, and burst through the stall door. In the yard, a rusted livestock trailer hitched to a box truck loomed like a cage on wheels. Two hired hands were fastening straps around Viejo's halter, dragging him forward. The horse planted his hooves, whipping his head back, his dark eyes searching behind him until they locked on the boy. A sound escaped him then, not a whinny, but a deep, guttural groan that seemed to come from somewhere beyond muscle and bone. Michael screamed for them to stop, but Harold stepped into his path. The old man's face was twisted with a cold satisfaction, the look of someone who had been humiliated and was now settling the score. He grabbed the boy by the collar and yanked him close, his breath sour with coffee and contempt. He told Michael that the horse was a piece of livestock, not a pillow. He told him that he would learn what it meant to be grateful for what he was given instead of sneaking around like a stray dog. And then he said the words that would sear themselves into Michael's memory forever. That nag is worth more to me dead than you are alive. The boy watched helplessly as Viejo was forced up the ramp. The horse's legs shook with resistance, his old joints protesting every step. Just before the trailer doors slammed shut, Viejo turned his massive head one last time, and his gaze found Michael's face, and in that gaze was something that should not be possible. A goodbye, a promise, an apology. The truck rumbled away down the frozen dirt road, its exhaust leaving ghost-like trails in the icy air. Michael stood in the yard, not moving, not breathing, as the sound of the engine faded into the dead winter silence. Harold spat on the ground and walked back toward the house without another word, leaving the boy alone in the frozen dirt, his world reduced to the fading tire tracks that led away from everything he had left. Inside the farmhouse, Harold poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, his face unreadable. He had done what he believed necessary. The horse was gone, the lesson was delivered, and the boy would fall in line. That was how he saw it. He did not understand what he had actually set in motion. He did not understand that bonds forged in survival are not severed by transaction slips and livestock bills. He did not understand that the boy standing frozen in the yard was not defeated. He was making a decision. For hours, Michael did not move. The sun climbed and descended behind gray clouds, the temperature dropping further as afternoon bled toward dusk. The neighbors noticed him out there, a small figure rooted to the frozen earth like a sapling that had forgotten how to bend. Martha Simmons, who lived a quarter mile down the road, watched from her kitchen window with growing unease. She had known Harold for 30 years, and she had watched him harden like old leather after his wife left and the farm began to fail. But a child was not a farmhand, and she had seen enough. When full darkness fell, Michael finally moved. He did not go to the house. He did not cry or call out. He simply walked into the barn one last time, retrieved the folded photograph of his parents from the corner of Vao's empty stall, and slipped it into his coat. Then he walked to the road and turned his face in the direction the truck had gone. He had no food, no map, no plan, just the tire tracks disappearing into the night and a certainty that burned hotter than the cold that bit at his skin. 80 kilometers away, the livestock buyer unloaded Vao into a crowded holding pen behind a slaughterhouse on the edge of a town called Morrison. The pen was packed with discarded horses, their eyes hollow, their coats matted with neglect. The buyer, a man named Collins, glanced at the old grey gelding with a practiced, disinterested eye. The horse was thin, worn, barely worth the bullet. He would be processed within the week. Collins slammed the gate and walked away, already thinking about the next lot. But something happened in that pen that Collins could not account for. As the other horses milled about in defeated silence, Vao stood apart, his head raised, his ears swiveling as if listening for a sound none of them could hear. The workers who passed through that night noted that the old horse refused to eat, refused to drink, and refused to lie down. He paced the fence line ceaselessly, his hooves stamping a rhythm into the frozen mud, his breath coming in sharp bursts that fogged the air like a machine. Back at the farm, Harold noticed the boy's absence only when his own stomach demanded supper. He searched the barn, the shed, the empty stalls. He called Michael's name into the darkness, but the only answer was the wind. At first, he felt only irritation, the inconvenience of a runaway child who would need to be fetched and disciplined. But then he looked down the road and saw Martha Simmons standing at the edge of her property, her arms crossed, her expression one he could not quite read but did not like. She had been watching his house all day, and she was not the only one. By morning, the whispers had begun. Harold called the sheriff to report Michael missing, his voice carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than guilty. But when the deputy arrived and began asking questions about the boy's sleeping arrangements, about the horse that had been sold, about why no one had noticed the child was gone until nightfall, Harold's answers started to fray at the edges. Meanwhile, Michael had walked through the entire night. The tire tracks had faded where the gravel road turned to asphalt, but the boy kept moving, driven by a homing instinct he could not explain. The cold was a predator, sinking teeth into his fingers and toes, numbing his cheeks until he could no longer feel his own tears. He trudged past shuttered farmhouses and skeletal trees, a tiny silhouette against a vast, indifferent landscape. Anyone watching would have seen a ghost, a child already half consumed by the winter, and yet he kept going. Because somewhere ahead of him, a horse he loved was waiting. But 30 miles away, locked inside a pen surrounded by animals bound for slaughter, something was changing. Vao had stopped packing. He stood perfectly still now, his head turned north, toward a direction he had never traveled, but knew as surely as he knew the shape of the boy's heartbeat against his flank. The other horses fell silent. The wind shifted. And in the deepest, coldest hour before dawn, the old horse lowered his head, charged the gate, and shattered the wooden bar with a force that should have been impossible for an animal his age. He was free, and he was running. Vao ran as though the years had fallen away from him. Across frozen fields and abandoned rail lines, through creek beds crusted with ice, the old grey horse moved with a purpose that defied every calculation of his age. Farmers who spotted him from their kitchen windows said later that he looked like a ghost, something not quite of this world, driven by a force no whip could summon. He never hesitated at crossroads. He never slowed to graze or drink. He simply ran, his head low, his nostrils skimming the frozen ground, as if following a thread only he could feel. 20 miles east, Michael was losing the battle against the cold. He had walked through the night and into the next morning, his thin coat no match for temperatures that had dropped to 12 degrees below freezing. His toes had gone numb hours ago, then his fingers, then his ears. The hunger had turned from sharp pangs to a hollow ache that gnawed at his insides. But it was the loneliness that nearly broke him. The vast, empty fields stretching in every direction, the grey sky pressing down like a lid on a coffin. He kept his parents' photograph clutched in his frozen fist, and every time his legs threatened to buckle, he looked at it and whispered a name. Viejo. The first person to notice the boy on the road was a trucker named Douglas Kaya, who was hauling grain along Route 9 early that morning. He saw a small figure trudging along the shoulder and almost kept driving. Hitchhikers were common, runaways less so. But something made him slow down, some prickle at the back of his neck that he would later describe as a warning he could not ignore. He pulled over 50 yards ahead and climbed down from the cab. By the time he reached the boy, Michael was barely standing, his lips blue, his eyes unfocused. Douglas wrapped him in an old blanket from the truck and tried to ask questions, but the boy could only repeat one word over and over like a prayer. Viejo. Back in Morrison, the slaughterhouse foreman discovered the broken gate at dawn. The wooden bar had been snapped clean in two, the splintered ends telling a story of impossible force. He counted the horses in the pen and came up one short, the grey gelding, the one that had refused to eat. He called Collins, the buyer, who swore under his breath and began making calls. A horse on the loose was a liability, and if it caused an accident, the lawsuits would rain down. But when Collins asked the neighboring farmers if they had seen the animal, their descriptions did not match the behavior of a panicked, aimless runaway. The horse was moving in a straight line, they said, north, fast, like it knew exactly where it was going. Two things happened at almost the same hour that morning that turned the situation from a runaway horse into a full-blown crisis. First, Deputy Morris arrived at Harold's farm for a follow-up visit and found Martha Simmons waiting at the end of the driveway. She had seen enough, she told him, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. She had watched Harold lock the boy out of the house night after night, had heard the child crying in the barn, had once seen the uncle strike Michael across the face for spilling a bucket of feed. And last night, she had watched the boy walk toward the road and not come back. Morris took notes in a small spiral pad, his expression hardening with each new detail. The second thing was that Douglas Kaya had taken the shivering boy to the nearest gas station and called for an ambulance. But Michael, despite his condition, refused to stay still. He kept trying to leave, kept pulling toward the door, his eyes wild with a desperation that terrified the adults around him. When the paramedic finally managed to take his vitals, the numbers were grim. Core temperature 34 degrees and dropping, heart rate erratic, fingers showing early signs of frostbite. If they did not get him to a hospital within the hour, the boy was going to lose digits, maybe limbs, maybe his life. But Michael fought them with the last shreds of his strength, screaming that he had to find Viejo, that the horse was coming for him, that he could not stop now. They sedated him for his own safety and loaded him into the ambulance, and as the doors closed, Douglas Kaya stood in the parking lot with the boy's crumpled photograph in his hand, realizing that he had just witnessed something he would never be able to explain. Deputy Morris put out a statewide alert for a missing horse and a missing child on the same frequency, an unusual combination that raised eyebrows at dispatch. He then returned to Harold's farm with backup, this time to ask harder questions. Harold, caught off guard by the second visit, tried to spin a story about a disobedient boy who had run away after being scolded. But Morris had been a deputy for 18 years, and he knew the difference between a runaway and a child fleeing for his life. When he asked to see the place where Michael slept, Harold led him to a bare room with a cot that had clearly never been used. The deputy pressed his palm against the mattress. Cold, no indentations, no sign that a child had ever lain there. In the barn, a different story was written in the straw. Morris found a depression in the corner of the largest stall, a nest of flattened hay that was still warm to the touch in places, as if a large animal had recently been lying there. Scattered through the bedding were the small, unmistakable signs of a child: a torn mitten, a pencil stub, a scrap of paper with a drawing of a horse, and a boy standing together under a sun that was just a circle with lines radiating outward. Morris bagged the evidence and radioed in a request for Child Protective Services. Harold watched from the barn door, his face pale for the first time since this began. But while the legal machinery ground into motion, a more primal story was unfolding across the rural landscape. Viejo had covered 40 kilometers by nightfall of the second day, his hooves churning through snow and mud with a relentless rhythm that seemed to transcend physical endurance. He skirted towns, moved through wooded lots, crossed a frozen river where the ice groaned beneath his weight but held. Each time he encountered a fence, he either jumped it or pushed through it, leaving tufts of gray hair on barbed wire that search parties would later use to map his impossible path. Witnesses who saw him said he never stopped moving, not even to rest, as if the act of pausing would sever the invisible cord that pulled him forward. The paramedics at County General had stabilized Michael, but the boy was in and out of consciousness, his body racked with shivering that the warming blankets could not fully suppress. In his delirium, he spoke only of the horse. He described the stable, the straw, the way Viejo would lie down so he could sleep against his belly. He spoke of the night his parents died, of the uncle's cold stares, of the photograph he kept in his pocket. And he kept saying, with a certainty that made the nurses exchange uncomfortable glances, that the horse was coming. They thought it was the fever talking, the brains misfiring under thermal stress. They did not know about the horse that was running north. On the third day, a farmer named Gerald Vance stepped onto his back porch and saw a sight that stopped him mid-stride. An old gray horse, gaunt and bleeding from multiple cuts, was moving across his southern pasture at a labored but unbroken trot. The animal's eyes were fixed straight ahead, and it did not alter its course when Vance called out. He watched it disappear into the tree line and picked up his phone to call the sheriff's office, describing what he had seen. The dispatcher cross-referenced the report with the open alerts and felt a chill run down her spine. According to the map on her screen, the horse was no more than 8 kilometers from the last known location of the missing child. Morris received the call in his cruiser and made a decision that would later be credited with saving 2 lives. Instead of routing all available units to intercept the horse, he ordered a search plane to sweep the area where the 2 paths seemed destined to intersect. He also called the hospital and instructed the staff to alert him the moment the boy regained coherence. Then he drove to the coordinates on the map and waited. Michael opened his eyes at 2:15 that afternoon. The fever had broken, and for the first time in 36 hours, his gaze was clear. He looked at the nurse standing beside his bed and asked, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, if they had found his horse. Before she could answer, the double doors at the end of the hallway burst open and a breathless orderly ran toward the nurse's station. He had just seen something in the parking lot that he could not rationally explain, and he needed someone, anyone, to come outside and confirm that he was not losing his mind. What happened next would be recounted in dozens of newspaper articles, and eventually a book written by the widow who witnessed it all. It would be debated by veterinarians and animal behaviorists who could offer theories but no definitive explanations. It would be held up as proof by those who believed in the inexplicable bond between human and animal, and dismissed as coincidence by those who trusted only what they could measure. But for the people standing in that hospital parking lot on that cold afternoon, there was no ambiguity. The horse had found him, and he was not leaving until the boy was safe. The grey gelding stood in the hospital parking lot like a statue carved from exhaustion and will. His coat was caked with mud and crusted blood, his legs trembling with the last reserves of strength he did not have. A small crowd had gathered at the sliding glass doors, nurses, orderlies, a security guard who had no protocol for this, and they watched in silence as the horse raised his head toward the building and let out a sound that was not quite a whinny and not quite a cry. It was a summons. And 3 floors up, in a sterile room where monitors beeped an unsteady rhythm, a 9-year-old boy opened his eyes and knew. They tried to keep Michael in bed. The doctors insisted his core temperature was still dangerously unstable, that his extremities were only beginning to recover sensation, that getting up risked cardiac complications. But the boy would not be held. He pulled the IV from his arm and swung his bandaged feet to the cold linoleum floor, and the sheer force of his conviction was such that nobody in that room could bring themselves to stop him. A nurse wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and guided him toward the elevator with the dazed expression of someone who had been caught up in something larger than protocol. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, Michael saw through the glass. The horse was 50 feet away, but it could have been inches. Vieo's dark eyes found the boy's face, and something passed between them that silenced every murmur in that crowded room. The old horse took one shaky step forward, then another, and then, with a grace that seemed to defy the weight of his years, he folded his legs beneath him and lowered his great body to the frozen asphalt. It was the exact same motion he had performed every night in the barn, kneeling, settling, making himself into a shelter. The message was unmistakable. I am here. I have always been here. Come. Michael crossed the distance without feeling the cold beneath his bare, bandaged feet. He dropped to his knees and pressed himself against the horse's heaving chest, burying his face in the coarse grey mane that smelled of hay and sweat, and a journey that had no rational explanation. Vieo turned his head and curved his neck around the boy's small frame, enclosing him completely, just as he had done through all those bitter nights on the farm. For a long moment, nobody moved. The security guard took off his cap. The nurse who had guided Michael outside wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, a woman named Elena Vance stepped forward and covered her mouth with both hands, because she had seen this once before, not in the physical world, but in a dream she had clung to during the long, dark months after her husband had died. Elena was 67 years old, a retired school teacher who had been volunteering at the hospital's front desk, since her husband's passing left her with too much silence and too many empty rooms. She had spent her mornings directing visitors to patient rooms and her afternoons reading to children in the pediatric ward. But she had never seen anything that moved her the way this scene moved her. She watched as paramedics gently approached the horse and boy, as blankets were draped across both of them, as Michael's trembling fingers entwined with Vao's mane and held on as if the world might try to pull them apart again. And Alina felt a pull of her own, a recognition that this was not an ending, but a beginning that required someone to step into the breach. The adoption did not happen all at once. Deputy Morris, who had witnessed the reunion with his own eyes and later described it as the one good thing I got to see in this job, filed his report with Child Protective Services that same evening. Harold faced charges of criminal neglect and endangering the welfare of a minor, and while the legal process would grind slowly, the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Martha Simmons's testimony, combined with the physical evidence from the barn and the uncle's own damning statements, left little room for defense. Within weeks, Harold had been placed under house arrest pending trial, and Michael had been assigned an emergency foster placement. But the social worker assigned to the case had seen the footage of the hospital parking lot, and she understood that separating the boy from the horse again would do more harm than good. It was Alina who offered the solution. She owned a small farm on the outskirts of town, a property that had once been filled with horses and laughter and the gentle chaos of a full life. Since her husband's death, the stalls had sat empty, the pastures untended, the farmhouse too quiet to bear. She had been looking for a reason to fill them again, she told the social worker, and here it was, a boy who needed a home and a horse who had already proven he would cross the entire county to protect him. The paperwork took 2 months. During that time, Vao was treated by a veterinary team that marveled at the condition of an animal who should have been dead twice over, once from age and neglect, and once from the impossible journey that had torn hoof and strained tendon and consumed every reserve of fat and muscle he possessed. The vet who oversaw his recovery, a young woman named Dr. Reyes, later wrote a paper about the case that was published in a veterinary journal. She concluded that the horse had survived because he had been running on something that could not be measured in heart rates and blood panels. When the day finally came for Michael and Vao to move to Alina's farm, the boy walked into the barn and chose the largest stall, the one with the southern window that caught the afternoon light. He laid fresh straw with his own hands and hung a bucket of water within easy reach, mimicking the ritual that had once been performed for him by a different pair of hands in a different barn, in a life that now felt like a half-remembered nightmare. Vao stepped into that stall and let out a long, slow breath, and his old bones seemed to settle into the bedding with the relief of a creature who had finally, after all this time, come home. The years that followed were quiet and full. Vao never fully recovered his strength. The journey had taken too much, and his age could not be ignored, but he lived for 6 more years, long enough to see Michael grow from a fragile, terrified child into a sturdy teenager who laughed easily and slept without fear. Each morning, the boy would come to the barn before school and press his forehead against the horse's broad cheek, and a silent exchange would pass between them that Alina, watching from the kitchen window, never tired of witnessing. She had lost a husband and found a grandson, and she did not take a single day for granted. The community that had followed the story from its first, terrible beginning did not forget. Donations arrived from strangers who had seen the news coverage, enough to cover the horse's medical bills, and then some. Michael, encouraged by Alina, began speaking at local schools about what Vao had taught him, about loyalty that asks for nothing in return, about the way love can travel across 80 kilometers of frozen ground and not miss a step. He was not a natural public speaker. His voice would shake and he would stumble over words. But whenever he told the story, he would end with the same image: an old horse lying down in a parking lot, making himself into a shelter, because that was what you did for the ones you loved. The surprising detail, the one that would later be told at church potlucks and written into a small, self-published memoir that Elena compiled in the final year of Vao's life, was discovered on the morning the horse died. Michael went to the barn and found the old gelding lying peacefully in his stall, his great chest still, his eyes closed as if in sleep. The boy knelt beside him and wept the tears of a loss that reopened every earlier loss, and when he finally lifted his head, he saw something half buried in the straw at the edge of the stall. It was a small, tattered mitten, the mate to the one Deputy Morris had collected as evidence 3 winters ago. Vao had carried it in his mouth all that time, or perhaps pressed it beneath his body, guarding it as he had guarded the boy. A piece of the child he had refused to leave behind. Michael held that mitten for a long time before he rose to his feet. Then he walked to the house, woke Elena, and told her that Vao was gone. They buried him beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture, the one with the wide branches that spread over the fence line. And when the grave was filled and the last shovelful of earth had settled, Michael reached into his pocket and placed the mitten in the ground, a final gift returned to the friend who had kept him alive. That might have been the end, a boy saved, a horse honored, a story told. But the thing about stories like this is that they do not end. They echo. They take root in the people who hear them and grow into something else entirely. Michael is 26 years old now. He runs a small equine therapy program on the same farm where Vao is buried, working with children who have lost parents, who have known cold nights and locked doors, who need someone to lie down beside them in the dark. He tells them about an old grey horse who taught him that being unwanted is not the same as being unworthy of love. And every winter, when the first snow falls, he walks out to the oak tree and stands there for a moment, remembering the warmth that found him in a frozen barn. Elena passed 3 years ago peacefully in the same farmhouse where she had watched a boy and a horse rebuild each other from the inside out. In her will, she left the property to Michael with a single instruction: keep the stalls open for whoever needs them. The program has since served over 200 children. Some arrive silent and withdrawn. Most leave with something that looks a lot like hope. And if you visit, you will see, hanging on the wall of the main barn, a small framed photograph of a grey horse and a dark-haired boy, and beneath it, a worn mitten sealed in glass. A reminder of the 80 kilometers that proved distance is no match for devotion. So we leave you with this question: what would you cross 80 kilometers of frozen ground to save? And who, in the quiet moments of your life, has laid down beside you when the world turned cold? If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Share it with someone who needs to believe that second chances are real. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles begin with a $40 act of faith, and the bond between a broken child and a dying horse can rewrite the ending that everyone else had already written.